So, yeah, my presentation here today is going to be the last sort of main one we have in this course from one of the facilitators. So I'm calling it Riparian Management Strategies Part 2, Stimulating Natural Regeneration and Planting. And it's intended to complement the Noreen's presentation last session, which I would call Part 1, and you'll see why in a second here. So I just want to kind of recap where we've been in this course so far. We worked on initially defining our riparian areas, and we moved quickly into creating a vision for them. So kind of thinking about all the different goods and services. Where do you want to get to with your riparian areas? We worked on step 3, the current state analysis, went out to our riparian areas hopefully and had a chance to look at their health to answer where we are at now in relation to where we want to get to. And now we're really into the thick of riparian management strategies, starting with last class with Noreen. And I've kind of categorized them into these 4 general broad categories that we were focusing on. First category is land use activity management. So that's managing existing things that are happening, activities that are happening in riparian areas, whether those are grazing, recreation, cropping, any beaver activities, anything like that. Those are things that Noreen mostly focused on last class. And then we get into what I would call stimulating natural regeneration. So going a bit beyond to sort of try to work towards restoring natural function beyond changing the activities that are happening in the landscape. Then we get into planting, number 3, and number 4, engineering. And as we go down this list of categories, I'm saying we get into increasing cost and or labor. It's harder and harder to do all those things, and maybe more extreme measures are required. I'm in this presentation today, I'm really going to focus on the middle 2, stimulating natural regeneration and planting. As you'll see, I'll touch on engineering at the end, but as you'll see, it's out of our scope here for what we're kind of getting at with this course today. But I'll mention where it might be necessary or not. So starting with number 2, stimulating natural regeneration. It's an interesting category of approaches I want to sort of bring to your attention for how you can kind of go about managing a riparian area. So it's useful when a management of the land use activity, so like let's say managing your grazing, by itself will not meet the goals within a reasonable time period. It's cheaper and less labor intensive than planting, but it requires some desired vegetation to be present and healthy. So these are what I would call the kickstart strategies, the kickstarting natural regrowth in and around your riparian area. And there's kind of a few different ones you can sort of try. I just want to highlight. One is the control of undesired species. So basically weeding out species that you don't want to release from their competition, the species that you do want. Through mowing, hand pulling, tilling, grazing, spot spraying around desired species are all strategies that you can use. In certain cases, cattle can be useful to beat back reed canary grass, which can take over a site and reduce diversity of other species. Cattle can be used on other grasses as well. And yeah, if you're looking to sort of make it so that you time it right so they go after the undesired species, but they leave the ones that you want, there's a kind of an art there, and it has to be very well managed and controlled. So this is an option if the reason why your undesired species, the species that you want to grow in your riparian area aren't there. You can try and do some weed control and the stuff that you don't want. Second strategy is interesting and something we've been experimenting with a bit in the last few years here is called root pruning. All right, so basically a lot of species that are tree and shrub species that are native to the to Alberta, actually throughout Canada, so BC as well. There, Megan, they spread by suckers from the roots. So a classic example of this is trembling aspen. They can send out root suckers, and their roots will travel along underneath the soil surface for 100 feet, even up to 150 feet sometimes. Not very commonly, but they can travel that far. Most of them are within the 20 to 30 feet away from the parent tree that's growing, and that's how they colonize new areas. And those root suckers will be stimulated if they're wounded, lightly wounded. They'll send out suckers, or even actually they'll be stimulated even if they're chopped up. They'll cause them to send up suckers. And also exposing bare soil, if there is a thick sod mat above, exposing bare soil will increase the heat and also stimulate them to sucker up. And so you can use that to your advantage. If you have a healthy stand of aspen or balsam poplar is another one, or even some shrubs like Saskatoon, chokecherry, rose, those are all species that spread by suckering. If you want them to spread somewhere and they're nearby, you can root prune, basically go along with some sort of a tool that cuts on a small scale, even a sharp axe or spade. On a larger scale, we've used furrowers, a plow, and anything like that. It's got to be a light. It's got to be. It can't be very frequent, and it's best to do this in the dormant season when the energy is in the roots. So when the leaves are not on the trees. But you can basically stimulate this to occur. And I wouldn't do this in any areas that are prone to erosion, and probably avoid it below the high water line as well, because you're changing, you're doing some disturbance. But it's a useful sort of really easy thing that you can do. And in the bottom picture here is balsam poplar that we accidentally did this to. We were doing this technique called mounding, which I'm going to show you later. It's a way of opening up little bare patches of soil. And we just were going along making mounds and planting seedlings into them. And then, but we had these like crazy suckers that were growing into each of the mounds that we were planting, each of this balsam poplars growing up as a sucker. It's just a few months of growth, but it overtook the seedlings we planted, which is great. I mean, we wanted tree coverage anyways, and balsam poplar worked for us. So we accidentally did this and sort of have been discovering this can work if you're nearby a healthy existing stand. Another option to consider, coppicing. So a lot of trees and shrubs, deciduous trees and shrubs, not conifers, not the spruce and the pines and stuff like that, but the aspens again and the poplars are adapted to being cut down, and they can spring back from that quite well. So I mean, in a natural system, that would be the beaver that goes along and chops down aspen perhaps, and then they sprout back up. But you can do that yourself, and what will happen when a healthy aspen is cut down, it'll sprout back up from the trunk often, and it'll also send out a lot of root suckers as well at the same time. So it'll have a similar effect to root pruning, potentially if its suckers can make its way through the sod mat, and you get potentially some sort of use out of the wood, if you want to use it for biomass mulch or something like that. And I should mention, it'll only send out root suckers. Only a certain category of species can send out root suckers, and a much broader category of species, most deciduous species in Alberta, will sprout back up, at least from the trunks, but only some will sprout back up from the roots as well. And we have a coppicing fact sheet, more information on this. We also have a root pruning fact sheet as well. So if you want more information on the species that do that in particular. Another option is scarification. So again, trying to encourage natural regen without going to the effort of planting. So scarification is basically exposing mineral soil. So exposing soil near adjacent species to encourage seed germination. So near species that are kind of going to seed and you want them to have a good regen, you scuff up the soil a bit. You expose a little bit of mineral soil there so they have a greater chance of setting seed. So I mean, in forestry, they've done this where they drag along like pine branches or just use these heavy harrows or something like that to scuff up the soil, so they try and get better natural regrowth from the forest. But you can do that, so you can kind of play with that yourself, or you can do that with livestock, like cattle can scuff up a bit. Again, this should be done carefully, and it's best done in the fall when things are going to seed. Like, so when you see the spruce with the cones and they're releasing them in the early fall, that's a good time to sort of if you wanted to have spruce or pine or fir regenerated, and that would be an option as well. Again, don't do these sorts of techniques in erosion prone areas or below the high water line. All these kind of techniques involve opening up the soil. But in this case, you're not really tilling up the soil. You're just kind of scuffing it up here and there, or just even hoof prints and stuff like that will make it more likely that the seed will sort of get to the soil surface and germinate. So those are some techniques from scarification, coppicing, controlling undesirable species, and root pruning are all sort of an assortment of techniques you can do if you want to try to stimulate the growth of species that you already have. They can be neat ones to experiment with. But then, of course, when that might not fail and you have certain species that you want to have, but they're not in the area, you might have to go to the effort of planting them. So when it's appropriate, when easier options are not enough, such as the ones that Noreen talked about, so changing your management first, seeing what grows naturally first, or maybe trying to stimulate natural regen first. So that's when planting, if that's not working, then you might need to resort to planting. And then it also is appropriate perhaps when you want certain goods or services in particular, and the species aren't there for that. So if you're really interested in fruit, like getting some Saskatoons or pollinator habitat in particular, and you're just not seeing that kind of that species diversity there, you can sort of boost that by planting. And I should mention planting is not appropriate everywhere, and it's not going to succeed very well in really actively slumping or eroding banks, or those with a very great steepness. At least planting seedlings on banks like this you see in this picture here on the side of the banks here, it'll have a tough time establishing before it gets washed away in the next flood or something like that. So you can do other things, which I'll talk about with these sorts of banks, and you can definitely potentially plant seedlings in the lower sections or on the upper zone, potentially, as long as they're fast growing species. They may be able to withstand the next flood, but something like this, they'll likely get washed away or erode away too quickly. So as hopefully you got a chance to see the videos, a screenshot of in the top right corner here, there's 6 steps to planting here, from site assessment, design development, sourcing stock, site preparation, planting, and maintenance. So those are kind of that's the process that we follow for doing a planting project. And those steps, we went through them in the video here. So hopefully if you got a chance to see those, that'll cover a lot of ground there. And also I want to recommend the Manual for Riparian Forest Buffer Establishment in Alberta. So that's a pretty comprehensive manual on those 6 steps as well. And so if you're looking for more in-depth information on any of them, then feel free to refer to that manual. It's in this session's, on the course webpage under this session's heading. You'll find it and can download it from there. And there's also, we have a bunch of fact sheets as well that kind of supplement a lot of the material as well. So lots of different resources. We did go through this if you saw the videos, these steps are gone through. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly here, these steps. And so hopefully I have a bit more time for questions. I'm just going to try to cover anything that I thought the video maybe didn't cover completely. So site assessment is something that it did cover. I mentioned we have our planting assessment worksheet, also available for download from this the course webpage for this session. So you can kind of use that. If you're interested in planting, I really recommend going out into your site with this worksheet and ticking your way through all these sort of questions. Can help you really make sure you don't miss anything in your design. So that's a recommendation there. And yeah, this worksheet is good for helping you define your goals for your planting and look at everything you got to consider, your competing vegetation, your soils, everything like that. So your assessment is assessment of your goals and site conditions. And then moving into design development, which is about finding a compromise between your goals and site conditions. So figuring out what would work kind of for both, more or less. And the key questions you want to sort of ask with that is what to plant and where to plant. Or sorry, a good design should answer those 2 questions. What are you going to plant and where are you going to plant it? And I'm just going to quickly go through this native agroforestry species database I was referenced in the video. It's a really useful place to get ideas of where, or of that first question. What are you going to plant? Because this database includes, you see on the left-hand side, there's a whole bunch of different search parameters, and the list kind of goes on there. You can sort of select certain species that either are adapted to certain conditions that your site has, or have certain characteristics that you're after, whether that's pollination strategy, whether that's they have edible fruits or nuts, whether they're nitrogen fixers, anything like that. And so this is a comprehensive database of all of the native, almost all of the native trees and shrubs of the grasslands, foothills, boreal forest, and the aspen parkland ecoregions of Alberta. And I recommend you, if you can copy down this link or remember this link, it's basically our website, our home website name, oz-ab.ca/species. We'll take you there. This is a brand new kind of thing we're having, and we haven't put a hyperlink out on our main website yet because we're still kind of ironing out kinks and stuff like that. We're still yeah, it's just a soft launch right now, and we'll be putting it and spreading the word pretty soon here. But you guys can get a sneak preview of it, and it should be pretty well up and running. We're still uploading pictures and stuff like that as well. So feel free to look at that, use that, and if you have any questions or note any glitches with it, feel free to let us know. So that's one way. Another way is to get species ideas from nearby healthy riparian areas, and a way, I mean, of answering what to plant. So if you're trying to increase the healthy riparian area, a great place to look is other areas that are looking quite healthy for themselves. What is growing there, and see if you can get similar stuff. In terms of where to plant, I've been talking about this a fair bit about starting, and the video mentioned starting from the average high water line and working your way back from there. And for the most part, that's where you see a lot of the trees and shrubs start to develop in riparian areas. You see that, especially when water is moving, you see less trees and shrubs below that average high water level and more above the average high water level. There's definitely exceptions to that, and I mean things like willow you tend to see it creeping in here a fair bit. But in general, if you're planting trees and shrubs above the high water level, that's a good place to start. And it's easier to do site preparation and things like that. And I should mention, as I mentioned in the video, herbaceous species are really important as well for riparian function. Generally, we don't worry about planting them quite as much because often they come in and seed themselves in pretty well. Like cattails and sedges seem to just pop up at any chance they get. But sometimes in degraded areas, you want to think about that too. And so when you figure out where you can plant, then you can start to map it out on Google Earth Pro. And Rebecca is going to go through this process later on this evening, just quickly show you how to measure out planting areas and lines so you can sort of calculate how many seedlings you might need for a project. And it'll be also useful for anybody who's looking to set up fencing for grazing or recreation, or calculate the area of their pastures or something like that. Okay, so that was a bit of a bit more detail there. In terms of sourcing stock is the third step. Got three options typically: stem cuttings, seedlings, and seed. And I recommend the Alberta Native Plant Council for an up-to-date list of native plant nurseries. So the Alberta Native Plant Council, yeah, on their homepage you can download this list, and it's really comprehensive. It's actually across the prairies, so you can find something hopefully that's nearby, a place to get different seeds or seedlings. And of course, I also want to spend a little bit longer on stem cuttings just to talk about them, because in the video we didn't really use stem cuttings, and so I want to just mention that's a total option as well. So stem cuttings, what they are is branches or stems of trees or shrubs that can grow into new individuals. So you cut them off, stick them in the ground, and they should have a good chance of forming roots and growing into a new individual tree or shrub. In Alberta, there's only certain species that do well with this. The most successful is willow, but then you can also do it with balsam poplar, plains cottonwood if you're in southern Alberta, and red osier dogwood. And you can get other things to root from cuttings, but they require a lot more babying and typically in a greenhouse or a pot or something like that. So these are the ones that you typically would use like actually in the field. And all of this should be occurring if you're thinking about doing cuttings. Everything should be done, both the planting and the harvesting, in the dormant season when the leaves are off the trees. And I just want to mention some cons and pros of stem cuttings. We found they're a bit susceptible to droughts because they take a little bit of time to get their root system established. So if you have a really dry year, it can be tough on them. They are labor intensive to harvest. I mean, you have to get a good stand of willow and get busy with loppers and pruners, but they are free. They're locally adapted. They have good similar genetic material to maybe your site if you can get them nearby. They can compete well with taller grass because they're pretty they're taller than maybe your average seedling, and they can also be used for something called bioengineering. And bioengineering is, yeah, using basically cuttings typically or other live plant material that its structure provides initial physical support that is enhanced as it grows. So when you first put it in, it's already supporting the bank. And then as it grows up, it forms roots, and those roots kind of sink into the bank and grow up. And I wish, actually, I should have put a before and after picture with these. These are not our projects. We haven't done any kind of really comprehensive bioengineering work like wattle fencing or fascines for our part. I think Cows and Fish might have done some. But yeah, these will sprout up, these fences, and form, and they're all living material and stuff. So maybe you can Google that and see some pictures of that at some point. But very, very interesting stuff. Okay, so that's cuttings, a little bit background on cuttings. Site preparation, which typically is done to address competing vegetation or soil compaction. Those are the two main problems that we try to address with site prep. And it can be done in a few ways. One is mechanical. Mechanical site preparation, basically going in with some sort of equipment or something to physically disturb the soil. It can address both competing vegetation and soil compaction, but it's not appropriate for steep terrain or below the high water line. Again, we want to avoid places where we could be causing more damage than good. Different options. This is all from our projects. Tilling, if you're dealing with relatively flat land and you have discrete planting areas, yeah, you can use plowing. So plow in strips. So create a smaller area of disturbance, and then plant on the edge of the furrow of the plow, or what we call mounding, which is making even smaller areas of disturbance, basically discrete area disturbance. You can use a mini excavator to do this, or you can use the specialized forestry equipment that we sometimes use if we're doing a lot of these at once. And I'm just going to quickly show a quick video. Let's see if this works here. Hopefully it does. Yeah. No. Is this working? There we go. Probably pretty choppy, and the sound's not coming through, but it's just basically making little holes in the ground, or digging into the ground a little bit, flipping over the sod, and then we're going to plant our seedlings in the hinge of that flip. And you can see on the right, I think that's a birch that was planted at the hinge of the flip of one of the mounds. The mounds we're making in this particular video were bigger than the mounds we typically make. But it's just to relieve the seedlings of competition right around
an example of mounding, right?
like just in the microsite where they are, competition from the surrounding grass. So anyways, just a little technique to show you guys. Another option for site prep, mechanical, is chemical, which you can use to beat back competing vegetation. It's more doable on steeper slopes because you're not like physically opening up the soil. But there's, I would recommend minimizing application, especially near water, due to government regulations. And in general, I have to say we haven't used chemical very much. We found mechanical to be the standard what we use, and we try other techniques as well. It's just a thing that we tend to avoid, particularly around water, because of there's regulations about that. The Alberta government has said regulations that should be followed there. And then there's livestock. So it's another kind of option for site preparation that was not covered in the video. I rarely use this, but I think it's got potential. A short, intense graze right before planting can knock back competition, give seedlings a head start. I've seen pigs do a great job of tilling up ground. Again, not appropriate in erosion-prone areas or below the high water line. So something to experiment with potentially, but yeah, be careful about causing worse problems than you're trying to solve. And for all cases, whatever sort of site preparation strategy you're doing, mulching is a really important long-term strategy to like control weeds down the line, because especially if you're opening up the soil with tilling it, or livestock with pigs or something like that. Yeah, having a way of keeping those weeds down is really important. I mean, you can try to keep the soil black around all the seedlings, or keep the weeds down, but they grow right around it, and so having that suppression around it is really important, whether that's with biodegradable plastic mulch, we've started to use a fair bit, with wood chips, laying down wood chips, or applying hemp mats, so woven hemp fiber, recycled material, and those will provide a decent weed suppression. Wood chips, I'd say you start to see things growing through earlier than the other ones, and you have to reapply it and stay on top of it. The great thing about mulch is that they also conserve soil moisture, and they moderate the soil temperature, reduces the extremes, and they can also improve soil condition, particularly things like wood chips. Can add organic matter to the soil, which is good. So they have other benefits as well. We typically recommend them. All right, and then we get into the planting stage, the actual planting part, and there's different techniques of doing this, and I'm not going to go into this. It was kind of covered in the video there, and it's also covered in the riparian planting manual as well if you're interested in learning more about planting. And then finally, maintenance. And again, as I mentioned in the video, that your most common threats for maintenance are the 3 W's: wildlife, weeds, and water. Those are the ones that most often will kind of compromise your seedlings or your cuttings or whatever you're planting. And so staying on top of them, whether with water irrigation or having systems set up in case you don't get the rain. For wildlife, we don't typically take action immediately because it's expensive and there's no great solutions for dealing with wildlife. But if you're starting to see a fair bit of browse in the area, then we talk about sort of different fencing options, tree tubes, that sort of thing. And then weeds. I mean, weeds is almost every project has to think about weeds. Even if in this case you can see this is a plastic mulched project, and the weeds are like, that's Saskatoon. This is in the fall, so that Saskatoon is sort of yellowing off because it's the fall. But you can see the weeds have sort of colonized. They come through the plastic mulch holes, and I mean, the Saskatoon is still doing okay, but weeds are kind of part and parcel of almost any project. So that's the 6 steps of planting gone through pretty quick, and with sort of the hope that this will kind of complement the video series there. And then the 4th major category of riparian management strategies is engineering. And in this case, engineering is what may be required on actively slumping banks or those with a steepness of greater than 4:1 vertical horizontal. So those really intense degraded banks, that's where if all else fails and it's just eroding actively and there's a lot of issues and it's near something that's high value, and it can't be given the time to sort of heal naturally, then there is a place for potentially a place for engineering. And there's the 2 main types: the bioengineering and the physical engineering. Now the bioengineering is, I've already talked about that, using a live plant material to basically hold the physical structure of your bank or whatever in place. Yeah, so it's kind of a hybrid between engineering and planting. But you can doing this is using live plant material is generally a really sustainable solution. But sometimes when things are really degraded and there's no other options, physical engineering is required as well, for that reinforcing or reshaping the channel, bank, or floodplain. And it's, again, last resort for cases where there's nothing, all else kind of fails. And I know there's also instances of physical engineering when you're looking to you have specific goals as well, like you're building a dam or something like that. But in all cases, when you're kind of physically reshaping or restoring the channel, bank, or floodplain, that's when a lot of the regulations kick in, and it's really important to consult in the province of Alberta Environment and Parks before attempting physical engineering work. I put their link there, and on our course webpage, we also have a bunch of links to relevant acts and legislation that might you'd want to consider before doing any sort of thing like this. If you're doing bioengineering, or some of the other strategies, you're probably okay. Or if any of the mechanical disturbance, my understanding is you're probably okay as long as you stay outside the high water line, particularly if you're not working around a permanent water body. You're probably okay with that. But if you're doing major disturbance, and even in certain cases, if you have to do major disturbance to try to heal it with bioengineering or something like that, it could be good just to double check with Alberta Environment and Parks. It's always good to be on the safe side, and my experience with working with them is they're easy to work with and to talk to and stuff. So just something to keep in mind. So in conclusion, there are 4 main categories of riparian management strategies. We've got management of land use activities that Noreen talked about last class, stimulating natural regen, planting, and engineering. And kind of, I'm sort of sharing them now because at this point in the course, because knowing where you want to get to, your vision, and where you're at now helps you choose what's appropriate for you. So not all of them are relevant for your context, but hopefully some of them might be, because if you start to think about your vision and your current health assessment, your current state analysis. And remembering that strategies may complement each other or provide multiple benefits. So it's not like you just have to only do planting or only do grazing management or something like that. There's ways to mesh them together well. Okay, that's